Thanks. And thanks everyone for showing up on a Sunday afternoon to think about faith and politics. You know, they say that these are the two topics that you're not supposed to talk about at polite dinner conversations, so I am a horrible dinner guest because I spend my time thinking about the intersection of faith and politics. And I want us to think about that, but I want us to do this primarily looking a little bit more historical today, and then near the end, and then at the very end, we'll have time for questions. But at the very end, before that, we'll talk a little bit about what's happening today. But I think it's important for us to realize how we got to where we are with this American experiment, so that we understand why it's so important that we don't lose it, that we don't go backwards. And we've had a lot of conversations that are happening right now, and more are going to be happening the next several months nationwide, approaching the 250th anniversary of the Declaration of Independence on July 4th next year. And as we think about this experiment in 250 years, I think it's important to realize how we got here. I want to first tell you a little bit about my family story that's related to this conversation. You see, the oldest Protestant church west of the Mississippi is about 2 hours from here in the St. Louis area. It was founded in 1807, Fifi Baptist Church. And my family founded that congregation. And actually, but before that, Abraham Music, my great-great-great-great-grandfather, he had held what is probably the first Protestant worship service in his own home. But you see, he had to hold it in his home because they weren't allowed yet to have Protestant churches, because that was before the Louisiana Purchase. That was even before the French owned this land that we bought it from. This is when it was Spanish territory. And so this was Spanish Catholic territory. And so you were only allowed to have Catholic churches throughout the Louisiana territory, including all of what is now Missouri. Now, there's some parts of the story that I would love to try to figure out. I don't know all of it. Abraham Music, my direct great-great-great-great-great-grandfather, was born in Virginia a couple of years after Thomas Jefferson in the same county. By the time of the American Revolution, he's living in North Carolina and fights in the Revolutionary War to help bring independence to this nation. And then at some point after that, he moves west a little bit and then keeps moving west, and then eventually moves across the Mississippi River in the 1790s, meaning he left the United States. And that's the part I really would like to know. It was probably mostly for economic reasons, but here he had fought to bring independence, and then leaves the United States and settles in the St. Louis area along with a number of people in the Music family. And there's an extra K. We used to spell music a lot of times that way. So the M-U-S-I-C-K, the Music family. And so they're a group of Baptists, but they're not allowed to have a Baptist church because this is Spanish Catholic territory. And so he wants to have permission to at least have a private service in his home. There's a Baptist preacher in Illinois. He wanted to invite him to be able to come over, lead a little worship service for the family. So Abraham Music goes to the governor of Louisiana Territory to make a formal request. Can we, have this Baptist preacher, just have it in our home? And the governor, of course, has to make a big show of rejecting it because it's not allowed. You're not allowed to have, under Spanish law, any other worship service. But then he tells Abraham to come over to his house that evening for supper. And this was where they could have the under-the-table gentleman's agreement that didn't necessarily follow what the dictates of the law was. And so he said, I will allow this, but he had 3 conditions. One of them was for the preacher, and 2 of them were for the small group of Baptists, which was mostly just the Music family. The one of the preacher was that he was set limits on how long he could come across the river and stay. And we know that they tracked him because he's written in it. He wrote it later in his diary and memoirs about how on the trip, the number after he'd been here too many days, or on the day that he's supposed to be leaving, someone would stop him that morning and be like, "So what day did you show up in the territory?" And he knew they already knew the answer to that. So they had tracked him as he crossed the Mississippi to make sure he wasn't staying too long. And so he would come over occasionally and lead a worship service. But there was 2 other requirements. One was they couldn't put a church bell up. That is, they could not mark the building as a church, right? It needed to look like it was just a home. So that was just people gathering for private fellowship time in their home, and the governor could say, I don't know what happens inside the private home, right? So that was the one provision. And then the other provision And I might pause here just to make sure we're all up on Baptist theology. So Baptists don't baptize babies, right? That's kind of how we got our name. Is then you have to wait until someone's old enough that they make a commitment themselves to become a Christian and follow Jesus, and then they get baptized. So this idea of a believer's baptism. Right? So this Spanish Catholic governor tells Abraham Music that the other provision is that they're not allowed to baptize their babies. Right? And so he said, I agree. Right? We promise we won't baptize our babies. All right? That was a pretty easy promise to make there. But there's a reason why that was a provision. Because that's getting to citizenship. Because the Spanish Catholic would allow anyone to settle, but they claimed that anyone born in the territory was now Catholic. Right? And so, which is an interesting provision. The Music family moved here with the understanding that the government would claim their children as Catholic. Right? Now, obviously, they didn't take them to the Catholic Church, and they had no intention of raising them as Catholic. But that was the provision, that they were supposed to be raising their children as Catholic. And so then to baptize the infants into any other tradition would be an affront not merely to the Catholic Church, but to the Spanish government. Because church and state were the same, right? They were united there. And that's the European model that was also a colonial model, right? We saw it right here where we live, the Spanish Catholic territory. That was the old European model, that your faith was dictated by the government. The king could announce what the faith was for the entire region. And we see this even in England, where most of the founders came from. There's the short but brief period with Bloody Mary, right? You know, who we now honor with a drink, I guess. I don't know all the history of that. I'm a Baptist, all right? But you know, I'm aware of the fact that there's a Bloody Mary, all right? Right? But there was a brief period of Catholicism being brought to England, and then switched back to being Anglican, being Protestant, right? So as a king would take over, we see this with some of the Spanish conquests in Europe. There were times when the Spanish government would take over new European territories, and then the religion was supposed to change. People would flee the region. I was in Belgium last year, and there's a couple of different cities there where half or more of the population fled because the government changed, and therefore the religion changed. And they were told they either had to convert or to leave. And then in Amsterdam, which was the freest city of all in the 1600s, they would kind of have the same provision that Abraham Music got here. You couldn't have a public church, but we would at least allow you to worship privately. And there's still a Catholic church there. It was Protestant, so the Catholics were the ones that had to worship privately there. I toured a Catholic church that from the outside just looks like another one of the Amsterdam buildings, right? But once you walk in, they had carved out the middle of the building so that you have this miniature church with 3 levels, 2 balcony levels, full organ and everything, that a rich merchant had made so that the Catholics could worship. They were allowed to worship, but they couldn't have it seen as a church from the street level, right? So there was Catholics being persecuted, here it was Protestants in the Spanish Catholic. That's the old European model. And that's the model you would expect us to have at our founding. Because most of the colonies at the time of the Revolution have a state church, just like all of the European models. There's a little bit of exceptions, and that's what I want to talk about, because that's this radical experiment that happens. So we often are told that people fled Europe and came here because they wanted religious freedom. You've probably heard that claim. Presidents of both parties like to make that claim, that people came to the New World because they wanted religious freedom. And that's partially true, but not really. All right? I mean, some people came for just economic reasons. They wanted new opportunity. A few people came because they were fleeing legal trouble or whatever. Like, hey, let's go across the Atlantic and they can't chase me down for my debts or whatever, and I can get a fresh start, right? Now, there were a lot of people that came here for religious reasons. They didn't necessarily come for religious freedom as much as they often just came because they were fleeing religious persecution. Now, that's a difference, because it wasn't that they believed in religious freedom for others. They just wanted to be the ones in charge, right? They didn't want to be persecuted anymore. They wanted to be the persecutors, All right? So that's how we get like Massachusetts Bay Colony. You're probably familiar with the name John Winthrop. You'll probably hear more about him in these next several months leading up to the 250th anniversary. He's kind of one of those early colonial figures that's really significant. He's the guy that gives the speech describing that we're heading over to this new land that's going to be a city on a hill, which he steals from Jesus. And it's, by the way, not about a colony or a nation or anything. Right? That's about the followers of Jesus. So the city on a hill is not a nation, right? It's a faith. But our presidents today like to borrow that. Ronald Reagan added the word shining, so now it's often a shining city on a hill. He borrowed that from Winthrop, who borrowed it from Jesus, right? So that's kind of this founding kind of mythos, right? We were going to go found this Christian nation as this city on a hill. But of course, in that same speech, Winthrop also lays out the justification for Native American genocide. In the exact same speech, which doesn't sound like too great of a shining city on a hill anymore, as he compares Native Americans to the Amalekites, an ancient tribe in the Old Testament that was a victim of genocide itself And so he says that unlike King Saul, who was unfaithful and disobedient and didn't kill all of them, we need to make sure that when we go to this new land, we're faithful. AKA that we go and kill all of the people who are already there. So that's this vision that we get with Massachusetts Bay Colony. Massachusetts Bay Colony is a Christian nationalist state. And so we see it following this European model. And if you want to think about a really simple definition of Christian nationalism, it is this idea of merging, I'd say it's the idea of fusing and confusing, but fusing and confusing your national and your religious identities. So in our context, it's the fusing and confusing of American and Christian identities. To say that to be a good American, one has to be a good Christian, and to be a good Christian, one's expected to be a good pro-American, right? And so Massachusetts Bay Colony is founded with that fusion. This idea that you have to be a good citizen, also have to believe the same way. Let me give you some examples. So Massachusetts Bay Colony, including with Winthrop there in leadership, executed several Quakers for being Quakers. I don't know if you know anything about Quakers, but like, if you can't get along with the Quakers, I mean, these are non-violent, peaceful folk. Like, if you can't get along with the Quakers, that really says more about you than it does the Quakers. All right? So they executed Quakers merely for being Quakers in Massachusetts Bay Colony. A number of other people were exiled for their religious beliefs. One of them was Roger Williams, was exiled. He had been a preacher, and he was preaching religious ideas that went against what the state was saying, this is our faith and our tradition. And so they exiled him in the winter. He goes and founds Rhode Island. He had this weird belief that you should buy your land from the Native Americans as opposed to just claiming you have it. So if you ever wondered why Rhode Island is so small, all right, that's what happens when you buy your land instead of steal your land. All right, it's really small. So Rhode Island's really small. He becomes the founder of Rhode Island. He also eventually becomes one of the co-founders of the First Baptist Church in the Americas. There in Providence, Rhode Island, with this belief that church and state should be separate. So what that had got him in trouble when he was preaching that in Massachusetts. In fact, one of the things he argued with the Ten Commandments was that if you think about the two tables of the Ten Commandments, so like the first commandments and then the latter commandments, he said the first table, these are the commandments like having no other God before thee, not making any graven images, not using the Lord's name in vain, the honoring the Sabbath. These are that first table. Secular civil government doesn't have authority over those. Now, the second table, you can make some laws related to those, like not killing people, right? You can make some laws related about making sure that you're not perjuring yourself, you're telling the truth, you're not bearing false witness, right? You can make laws about the second table, but he insisted that civil authority has no authority over the first table. Well, the Massachusetts Bay Colony people didn't like that because they wanted to claim authority over all of your life, over both tables. So in Rhode Island, he offers this alternative idea. And he wrote about this idea of having the need of a hedge sometimes it's called a wall, but a hedge separating church and state, separating the wilderness from the garden. Now, you can get a little bit of a sense of his leaning there. So to be very clear, state was the wilderness and the church was the garden, all right? So, there's a little bit of an anti-government bias there. But, sometimes when we look at politics today, maybe we're like, that sounds about right. So this was a principle that he's offering as this alternative model. So when we get into the founding era of the United States, we really do have this option. We could go either way. Will we stick with the traditional European model that we would today call Christian nationalism, where you merge church and state? Or would we try something different that's never really been tried on a large scale? Right, Rhode Island is experimenting with it, but it's not really been tried. And here's how radical this idea is. So in 1776, so we're coming up on our 250th anniversary, in Massachusetts colony, so the Massachusetts Bay Colony is now known as just as Massachusetts Colony, a group of Baptist preachers go to the colony authorities wanting to separate church and state, like they have in Rhode Island. The Congregationalist Church, which is kind of one of the predecessor bodies today to the United Church of Christ, but there's still a lot of congregational churches, particularly in New England. Today, the Congregational Church was the official state church still. So Winthrop's church is still the official state church. There's a bit more freedom, but in Massachusetts, you could still be fined and even jailed for having an unregistered church. And so there were Baptists that had been persecuted even at the founding era for being Baptist in Massachusetts. So this group of Baptists go and they want to separate church and state. The request was denied. One of the men on the panel was named John Adams. Yeah, the future president, John Adams. And John Adams is adamantly opposed to separating church and state. In fact, he tells them it's not going to happen, that there is more likely to be a change in the solar system than a separation of church and state. Now, I don't know if Adams studied the stars very closely that evening as he walked home. Because not only did that change in the solar system happen, he lived to see it happen in his own lifetime. Massachusetts was the last state to disestablish church and state. But they did it even while John Adams was still alive, after he had been president. But I use that because that shows you how remarkable, how radical of an idea it was that we would separate church and state, that even someone like John Adams was like, that's ridiculous. Like that, not only I'm opposed to that, it can't happen. It won't happen. Now, I have to note then, right, this gets to that issue of, we often hear a lot of talk about the founders believe this and the founders believe that. So when it comes to issues like church and state, it's important to remember the founders didn't agree with a lot of things. Right? There's very little things that all of the founding fathers actually agreed on, other than they didn't like King George III. I mean, that's about it, right? They really, read the Declaration of Independence. It's we all used to like quote the beginning, which all sounds inspirational. Some of the stuff is just like petty about the king, right? All right. So eventually they really don't like him, but they disagree about whether or not we should be a Christian nation or not. John Adams, Patrick Henry. Some of these guys want us to have a Christian nation. They lose that debate to Thomas Jefferson and James Madison, right? So again, we have George Washington serves as president, and then immediately we have two parties, one led by John Adams, the other led by Thomas Jefferson, and these men despise each other. I mean, they later became friends later on after they've both been president. It's kind of a George H.W. and Bill Clinton kind of thing going on, right? Right? Like the same kind of thing. They kind of become buddy later. But at the time, they hated him. I mean, the 1800 election between Jefferson and Adams, when Adams was the incumbent and gets kicked out of office, the first president to lose re-election, right, is one of the nastiest presidential elections ever. Still. It's still like in the top 5 nastiest elections. They despise each other. And religion was one of the things that came up a lot in that particular election. So when we have this debate, will we be a Christian nation or will we do something else? Jefferson and Madison win that debate. They're the ones that help make sure that we have a nation where we have a separation of church and state. You probably hear this claim a lot, that we were founded as a Christian nation. if that were so, all you would have to do would read the Constitution and find it. Right? We know what a Christian nation looks like. They say so in the Constitution. Like the Confederate States of America was founded as a, quote, Christian nation. Right? They put God in the preamble of the Confederate Constitution to claim that this new nation would be Christian. But when you look at the U.S. Constitution, that language isn't there. The only religious reference in the original Constitution is Article 6 prohibiting religious tests for office, which is literally the opposite of a Christian nation. Right? If you're trying to create a Christian nation, you would put a provision to only allow Christians to serve, and we know this because a lot of the colonies/states actually had that law. Right? There were actually a number of places, and in fact, some of the laws weren't even taken officially off the books until just the last few years. They were no longer applicable, they were unconstitutional, but they were still on the books, having a religious test for office, barring atheists and sometimes others from serving in office. But the U.S. Constitution, the only religious reference was that anybody can serve, even if they're Baptist, Catholic, Muslim, atheist, it doesn't matter. It's a radical idea. And then we follow that up with the First Amendment, which has the two clauses: no establishment of religion, and then also guaranteeing the free exercise thereof. And Thomas Jefferson, right, he writes this famous phrase about a wall separating church and state. Again, I want to note that he was borrowing that language from Roger Williams little over a century before, and he was writing that letter to a group of Baptists in Connecticut. And I'm not suggesting he's pandering, but, politicians do, pander. All right, Thomas Jefferson believed it, but he knew who he was writing to. It's not a coincidence that the time he uses that language is when he's writing to Baptists and not some other group. Because he's assuring them, they had wrote to him first, and he's assuring them, I stand with you on this. I know what you believe. And he specifically explains the First Amendment. He quotes the entire First Amendment and says, this is what has created the wall of separation between church and state. So when you hear people say, well, there's no separation of church and state, that's not in the Constitution. Like, well, okay, yeah, sure. The actual phrase isn't there. But you know what else isn't in the Constitution? The phrase religious liberty. But we all believe in that, right? Just because the words aren't there doesn't mean that it's not a constitutional principle, a concept. I mean, for Christians, when I use this example, I say the word Trinity is not in the Bible, but it's a Christian theology, and I believe in it because it's a word that describes the concepts that are there. So the separation of church and state describes what the First Amendment does. And why do we know this? Because Thomas Jefferson himself, who knew a thing or two about our founding ideas, Thomas Jefferson himself says the First Amendment creates the wall of separation between church and state. So the phrase is not in the Constitution, but it's a constitutional principle. We really were founded on this separation between church and state. Thomas Jefferson, of course, needs a separation of church and state, if you will, because it doesn't really matter what church you go to. Thomas Jefferson's a heretic. I mean, maybe I shouldn't say that in the city of Jefferson, but I love Thomas Jefferson and all. I went to Thomas Jefferson Middle School. I won the Thomas Jefferson essay contest. I think it was the first time I was printed in the News Tribune. My essay was printed in the News Tribune. The prize was like a $50 savings bond, which I was disappointed to later realize I didn't get like $50 for like 30 years or something like that. And by that point, $50 didn't mean anything to me. It really would have meant a whole lot to me in 8th grade, but when I finally matured, it's like, well, that's $50. And then also I got to have lunch with a Thomas Jefferson impersonator. Like that was my prize. All right? So I get I love Thomas Jefferson. But the dude was a heretic, all right? I mean, he literally is cutting out anything in the New Testament he doesn't agree with. He's cutting out the miracles of Jesus. He wants Jesus just to be this teacher, this moral philosopher, right? There's no church today that would accept Thomas Jefferson as he was as one of the members. So, of course, Thomas Jefferson needs a separation of church and state. James Madison is an interesting figure because James Madison is devout. And not only is he devout, he's a member of the Anglican Church, or the Episcopal Church today. Meaning, when Thomas Jefferson and James Madison disestablished church and state in Virginia, they disestablished the Anglican Church. James Madison disempowered his own church in Virginia before then also doing that nationally with the First Amendment. That is amazing to me as a model of someone who realized that church and state was better separate, even if it means I take away power from my very own church. James Madison was a person who would have had religious privilege, and he took it away. And then years later, after he's president, he's writing in a letter to someone, and he explains that this separation was good for both government and religion. He said it saved the government from all of the sectarian fighting that they saw in Europe, not just in the past, but was continuing to happen at that time. But he said it also allowed religion to flourish. And that's truly what we've seen. It's why America has always had a much higher level of religiosity than any of our similar nations in Western Europe. Right? It was because of this radical experiment of separating church and state. And I think that's what it's really important for us to recognize what a radical idea those was, what an amazing experiment it was, and how good it's been for government and for religion, so that we understand why we have to stand up for it today. So I want to be very clear, the idea of separation of church and state is under attack today. Eric kind of hinted at the fact that people will respond to you, well, that's not in the Constitution. It's like, yes, but it's a constitutional principle. People will talk about how they want us to return to being a Christian nation. Again, we were not founded as a Christian nation, and people who wanted us to be a Christian nation complained about the Constitution at the time. They called it a godless constitution. And they didn't mean that as a compliment. Okay? There was a movement for decades to put a new clause in the preamble of a constitutional amendment, to put Jesus in the Constitution, because they wanted to change the godless Constitution. But now what they'll do is we have pseudo-historians, fake historians like David Barton, who was a mentor to Speaker Mike Johnson, and is highly influential with a number of other politicians as well. Ted Cruz, a number of others have praised him. One makes up quotations by James Madison and other things that we know weren't actually said. But then two, a lot of times he'll just distort the record, right? So he'll like to quote John Adams. See, John Adams said this. We were made as a Christian nation. But again, John Adams lost the debate. Like, it is true that John Adams did say things that would suggest he wanted a Christian nation, because he did want a Christian nation. He just that he lost that debate to Jefferson and Madison, as well as others. And so he distorts the record, but has been very successful in doing so. And so now we have this constant push, just a couple of blocks from here, to continue to inject more and more Christian nationalism that is only going to be bad for both civic society, for government, for our society, but also, it will be bad, and I say this as a Baptist minister, it's going to be bad for the faith. It has never worked out well when we have united church and state. Tony Campolo, a Baptist author and professor who passed away last year, I think described it best. He said that mixing church and state is like mixing ice cream and manure. It doesn't hurt the manure, but it sure messes up the ice cream. And it's a little bit that same kind of like opinion that Roger Williams was giving with his wilderness and garden metaphor right there, right? But we know that it has never worked out well for the church. It has always meant that religion has been perverted for power. And it's just ended up being just power. And then when people rebel against the state, what happens is they also reject the church that was holding up the state. Right? So mixing the two together always ends up undermining the credibility and the witness of the church that is attached to the government. Let me give you a really key example, just to give you some examples that have been showing up in just a couple of blocks from here. I've testified over the last few years about 40 times in the state capitol, primarily on Christian nationalism, church-state issues, because it's an area that I know well, and it's an area also where I know that my voice can make a bit of a difference, right? Because it used to surprise them when I would show up and announce that I'm a Baptist minister and I'm here against this bill to force the Bible into public schools. And they look at me like, what? That doesn't make sense. And I have to explain to them, it's not because I don't care for the Bible. I'm here because I do care for it, right? And I don't want the state picking winners and losers when it comes to religion and deciding what version of the Bible is going to be forced upon my student, my son, who's now at Thomas Jefferson Middle School, right? And because that's the job of his family, and it's the job of his church to teach him how to pray, how to read the Bible, right? And so, but as I've been testifying against these bills, it means I'm primarily in education committees, because that's the focus. That's the focus of Christian nationalists today, is that they're trying to inject more and more Christianity into the public schools, and one narrow slice of Christianity, right? They want one version, not just any Christianity, one narrow version. So let's think about this with a bill. We saw it pop up this year. I'm sure it'll be back in January, and it's passed in a few other states already, and that's an attempt to force the 10 Commandments onto every single public school classroom. This idea emerged in Texas a couple of years ago. It actually failed that year, although Texas passed it this year. Louisiana passed it last year, and then Texas and Arkansas passed it this year, but it was introduced in 20 plus states across the country, including Missouri this year. Now, I need to give a couple of caveats about this. I mean, first of all, there's a problem with the bill, because what do you mean by the 10 Commandments? And you may not know this, so there are actually different versions of the 10 Commandments. The words are basically the same, but we order them differently. So Catholics and Jews and then Protestants, with a few exceptions. Lutherans are like Catholics in how they order the 10 Commandments, but the rest of the Protestant world, there are different ways of where we draw the lines to what are the 10 Commandments. So if I were to ask you what's the 5th commandment, it might depend on which church you go to. All right? All of that nuance is completely lost, because what every single one of these bills does is it doesn't say post the 10 Commandments, it says post, and then it gives word for word what you have to post. So at that point, already should be a big red flag. It's the state picking winners and losers when it comes to religion. But it actually gets more troubling than that, because all the news reports always say that they're wanting to post the 10 Commandments on public school classrooms. But that's really not accurate. Because if you go and read what was in the bill that was filed here in Missouri and in all the other states, you could flip through every single Bible. I mean, we could probably go check out the Bible section. We're here in the library, right? Probably have all the translations. If not, we can go to the website, BibleGateway.com or whatever. You can try all the different. You will not find a single Bible that matches what the bill says has to be on the walls of the school classrooms. They're not requiring the 10 Commandments. They're requiring a highly gerrymandered version of the 10 Commandments. I used to call it highly edited, but this year we're going to call it gerrymandered. All right? A highly gerrymandered version of the 10 Commandments. They started with the King James version of the text, so Protestant, right? So that's already telling which side they're taking on there. But then they edited it down. I did a word count. They deleted 63% of the words and said, this is what you have to put as the 10 Commandments. So if you actually copied it and pasted it from your Bible, you would be in violation of the law in the 3 states that have passed this, because they have told you what you have to do. So literally copying and pasting from the Bible would put you in violation of the law. Now, a lot of the stuff they cut out is some like theological statements, right? So it starts, I am the Lord thy God, which is actually not one of the 10 Commandments, it's the preamble, but the bills require you to put that statement. And then it puts a period there, but the Bible doesn't actually put a period there, it puts a comma, who have brought thee out of slavery out of Egypt. Right? It's a theological statement. God is explaining to God's people why they should view God as God. Because God brought them out of slavery. I guess we can't put that in public schools because that sounds too much like DEI. So maybe that's why we had to cut that section out. Right? So it's a theological statement. It's completely cut aside. Now, like I said, so almost 2/3 of the passage is deleted from the text. Then, and this gets worse, then they actually rewrote a couple of parts. There's one little spot that didn't make sense. They changed a little like thou, thee. They changed one of those little these and thous. They flip it. I don't know. It's a minor little thing. But still, I'm like, why are we rewriting the text? The biggest one comes at the end, where the bills, if it were passed in Missouri, and like I said, it's already passed in 3 states, say that the version that would go on the walls of the public schools has to say that you cannot covet your neighbor's cattle. It's not what the King James says.
The King James says you cannot covet his ox nor his ass. So, I mean, I was literally sitting next to the senator who sponsored the bill in the committee after he testified, and said, I don't know if the sponsor is suggesting it's now okay to covet your neighbor's donkey, or just wanted to edit the word ass out of the Bible. But either way, we really shouldn't have a Missouri General Assembly version of the Bible. Like, I don't need the lawmakers rewriting what the text says. And it actually got worse here in Missouri. So that's the version in the 3 states that passed. I was back in the Missouri Senate Education Committee. I'd gone to testify on a different bill, and then they brought up to vote on the Ten Commandments, the Ten Commandments bill. Let's put that in scare quotes, because again, it's not the actual Ten Commandments, but what they're calling the Ten Commandments. And they decided they wanted to make another change. They wanted to change thou shalt not kill to thou shalt not murder. It's because they want to justify killing people with capital punishment. All right, so the kill make this sound like the state's violating the Ten Commandments. When we call it murder, that's something different. Now, I would say either way, it's homicide. That's literally what goes on the death certificates. It's state homicide. But, I watched them, and they just voted on it. And I was like, I've never served on a Bible translation committee, but I kind of expected to be a little bit more exhaustive. Like at least to open up like the Hebrew here. Like let's check through the word and see like maybe how we might want to translate this. They just voted by majority with no debate to rewrite the Bible in committee. Again, fortunately the bill didn't make it all the way through. It died when the session ended, but it'll be back. But this is the wild situation that's happening here, is that they want to take one interpretation of faith and put it into our schools. And while I make some jokes about it, it's a really serious problem, because what it's going to do is if you slap those on every single wall, you're sending a message to every single kid in our public school system. The only schools that serve every single kid. And you're telling them, if you don't believe this, you're a second-class citizen here in your own school. Or if your parents and your house of worship are teaching you a different version of the Ten Commandments, they're wrong. This is the state-approved version of the Ten Commandments. This is what the Ten Commandments really are. That's a dangerous message to be sending in our public school system. And we should stand up against that. I could give you a lot of other examples. That's the one that I think was a big one this year. It'll be back next year. And it's important particularly for those of us who, like James Madison, are a devout member of a church. It's particularly important for us to stand up against Christian nationalism and to say, no, we want a separation. We don't want to judge people, make people second-class citizens just because of their religious beliefs. And I believe in our pluralistic society, this is the way we create flourishing for all of us, to have that true religious liberty that is only possible when anyone and everyone is free to believe or not as they so want and as they so desire. We've got 15-ish minutes for questions, and so I'd love to, I could keep going for like hours, but you all didn't sign up for that. So I'm going to make myself pause, because I would love to have some chance to dialogue with you.
Thank you so much. I learned a tremendous amount. So what's the very best way for all of us to fight it? When you said we've got to fight this, so please give us very specific, tangible actions that we should all take that you think will be the most effective for that education committee and beyond.
Yeah, that's a great question, and part of it is we just have to be paying attention and showing up. And honestly, when people ask me a lot of times, like, you know, how do I fight back against Christian nationalism? I say focus on the area of education. And the good news about that is you can actually make a difference. You know, Washington, D.C. sucks all of the oxygen out of the room. It gets all of the attention. And yes, there's Christian nationalism in Washington, D.C. right now. But when it comes to education, which, as I said, is the focus, it's the number one area of Christian nationalists right now. That's decided in the state legislature, and that's decided in the school board. And those are places you can actually show up and can actually make a difference. And so that's important for us to be paying attention. What's happening with our local school board, what's happening with our state lawmakers and the education committees, so that we can show up. And then they need to be hearing from us. If no one shows up to testify against a bill, the lawmakers go, well, nothing wrong with me voting for it. No one's against it. Right? No one's going to be mad at me for supporting it. But if we show up in mass, or they hear from us in emails and phone calls, then they know, wait, this bill's controversial. Maybe I need to pause. Maybe we can slow it down.
So yeah, I'm sorry, I meant specifically about the bill, about if the bill should come back.
Yeah.
The 10 Commandment bill is go to hearings, find out how our elected officials call
That's right.
them, ask them what their position is.
You can show up in person, and if there's something, reach out to me. If you're more interested in particularly that kind of level of advocacy, and I'll end with a couple ways to connect with me. Or when it's going to a committee, you can email everybody on that committee and let them know. Here's how I feel about this bill, and this is why I'm opposed to it. And lean into, if you have a faith tradition, lean into that. If you have experience with the public school system, lean into that. Let them know why you have a vested interest in this. And when it goes to a floor, you want to talk particularly to your own local rep or local senator. But when it's a hearing, feel free to contact every single person on the committee. Oh, yeah.
So, could you back that up even further and say, watch your local school board races and show up and ask questions when you're ready to fill slots on the school board, find out what their philosophy is, what they have.
That's right. So, and one of the ways to think about this is, if you want to think about the ways that we ask school board candidates questions, right? So what I want to be very clear is we do not want to impose religious tests on people. But what I am curious is, are they going to try to impose their religion, right? So I don't care, a state legislator or a school board member, if they go to church, and if so, where they go to church. But what a relevant question is asking them things like, what do they think about efforts to put the 10 Commandments on public school classrooms?
So that'd be like the way to phrase.
That doesn't tell us where they go to church or if they go to church, whatever. I want to know, are they trying to impose religion on others? And so those policy-related questions can be really helpful to help us figure out what school board members, or it comes to issues like banning books, right? Yeah. Finding out if there's a school board member or candidate who wants to ban books. That's a big red flag that we should be addressing.
A continuation of the same vein, you see a connection between Christian nationalism and the whole voucher thing that we have now passed in Missouri.
Yeah, no, I think that's right. I think so. A big push of the vouchers, a big part of that has been coming from Christian nationalists. Not everybody who supports vouchers is a Christian nationalist, but a lot of Christian nationalists have been pushing for vouchers in Missouri and many other states. I mean, there was just the data that was out really recently from, I think, the Missouri Independent that showed the money from our kind of voucher request program, and the vast majority of it going to Christian schools, mostly Catholic, but then also some Protestant. Also, some Jewish and Islamic schools got just a little bit of money. So, if you're for the voucher program, then you are also funding, Islamic schools. So you have to. I mean, I don't know. The Christian nationalists don't normally want to do that, but you can see that the vast majority of the money is not going to private, secular schools. It's going to fund sectarian education, and that's actually something that's our state constitution, because we don't fund sectarian worship or education. We're not doing a great job of following national or state constitutions these days. But since the founding of Missouri, we have drawn a line here that we should not be choosing sides and funding sectarian faith. That congregations need to be funding themselves, not getting government funds for that, because that creates a whole lot of problems when you just have the majority could vote to give themselves more money, right? The majority faith would get more money, and then demanding taxpayers to pay for someone else's, sectarian push.
So Brian, for political movements to be successful, they need to demonize somebody. So as they make this movement on this Christian nationalism, particularly this 10 Commandments and other initiatives you're seeing in the state capitol, who are they demonizing as part of this process?
Who are they demonizing to push the 10 Commandments?
Yep.
It's good. I was hoping you were going to ask me who I was going to demonize. We need to have a successful political movement here. So it is this. It's atheist, right? It's Satanist. It's which actually the Satanists don't actually worship Satan. The Satanic Temple is more of a satirical thing. But anyways, they don't seem to always catch that in the state capitol when they show up to testify. But that's who it is.
It's, they'll make it ideological too. They'll say it's, it's liberals because they're atheists, but Christians are conservative, right? And this is why it's really important for those of us who are Christians as members of the majoritarian faith to show up in opposition to Christian nationalism, right? Because it's really easy. If only atheists and Jews show up to testify against something, it's really easy for them to be like, well, that's just what the atheists and the Jews think, right? But if then the Christians show up, so at the Ten Commandment hearing, we not only had a number of clergy there, we actually had more Christian clergy there to testify against the bill than total number of people who showed up to testify for the bill. And then we also gathered signatures from people across the state, had about 200 Christian clergy from across the state who signed opposing the Ten Commandment bill. And again, it's that James Madison approach, right, of recognizing we might have the position religiously of privilege, so let's use that to protect the religious liberty rights of all people, not just ourselves.
So, Brian, do you think that the people that are pushing the Christian nationalism are doing that because that's what they think their constituents want? Or what do you think is driving it from that end?
Maybe repeat the question.
Oh.
Yeah, that's a great question, whether or not it's doing it because of the constituents. I think some of them are true believers. Some of our lawmakers, they don't care if their constituents want Christian nationalism. I think there's a couple things that are happening. I think some of it is power, right? So Christian, because who wants to vote against the Ten Commandments or vote against the Bible or vote against prayer, right? And so it's a power, it's a marker of saying this is our nation, and they're creating a particular version. Again, it's a vision of it's a white conservative evangelical Protestant version of Christianity. Like they're saying, like we're the true Americans and everyone else is not. And so it is a power marker more than anything. And then over here I got to see a couple hands. So yeah.
Back to that voucher thing. So this Ten Commandments is just for public schools, but the religious schools get money. So are they saying that they can do any version of Ten Commandments they want to do?
Yeah, they would be, right? That'd be the irony. So the private schools can do anything they want, which is fine, right? That's the whole point. Is they can put a religious test for their teachers. They can put a religious test for their students. Private schools are allowed to reject students, right? Which is why public money should only go to public schools, right? People have the right to have a private school, and if they want to have a sectarian education for their children, we allow that right. But that doesn't mean that the public should be expected to pay for it if they're not going to follow all of the other rules when it comes to non-discrimination, for instance.
You alluded to it very briefly, but could you talk about the connection between white supremacy and Christian nationalism?
Yeah, that's a great question. So usually I describe Christian nationalism and white Christian nationalism, or white supremacy, but white Christian nationalism as synonymous in the American context. It's not true everywhere. There's Christian nationalism and religious nationalism of other faiths in other places, right? Authoritarians are always looking for ways to hold their power, and religion is a powerful force to do so. So, there's Hindu nationalism on the rise in India. There's Islamic nationalism on the rise in Turkey. There's Christian nationalism in another country, in a number of countries. But in the United States, white Christian nationalism has married together Christian nationalism and white supremacy, and it makes sense. Because if the founding myth of Christian nationalism is that we were founded as a Christian nation, and I already unpacked how we were not, but if you believe we were founded as a Christian nation that was founded on the genocide of Native Americans and the enslavement of black Africans, which doesn't sound very Christian to me, there was only a nation for white Christians, right? So if we have this Christian nation, it was a white Christian nationalism from the beginning. It was only for white people.
That's what Eric Schmidt thinks.
Particularly.
Yeah.
Right? And so but we also see this with Christian nationalism today. There's a lot of sociological research from people like Robert Jones at PRI, or sociologists like Andrew Whitehead and Samuel Perry, that show that Christian nationalism is a powerful worldview and it overlaps with a lot of other perspectives. So people that are high on a Christian nationalism scale are also more likely to hold racist positions like believing against interracial marriage, that it shouldn't be allowed, and believing that there's no negative economic consequences today because of slavery for black Americans, right? And so we see this high connection between Christian nationalism and racist opinions. So it's very much tied up together. Again, this is what I mean by this idea of it's only about one version of Christianity. Christian nationalism is not trying to empower everyone. It's about trying to empower one version of Christianity, to the point that we have a lot of Christian nationalists today who would look at, just to give you an example, our first black president and say, well, he wasn't Christian, and then look at our current occupant of the White House who hasn't attended a worship service in 3.5 years other than inauguration and funerals, and has 3 wives and multiple affairs, and say, well, he must be a Christian, right? That's white supremacy. That's not Christianity, if you're going to take that opinion. So we see a really strong connection between Christian nationalism and white supremacy in the U.S. context today. And we're running low on time, so maybe we can pepper in a couple real quick.
Just to support that, 25 plus years ago, I sneaked into a David Duke of the KKK organizing meeting in St. Louis, the European American Rights Organization. And there in that meeting, they said, we want to put our people on school boards, county commissions, get them elected. That was the strategy, sounds like conspiracy theory, but was the strategy to get these kind of people in every local position we can. That's not representing constituency. That's pushing an agenda.
Yeah.
On the Ten Commandments bill, in the hearing or in any part of this, bringing it up, what is their justification? Like, why are we having a bill about Ten Commandments in the first place?
Oh, yeah.
The only
Good
thing
question.
I've heard is, if that is on the wall in every classroom, we will bring down all the school shootings and crime.
Yeah.
So they do actually claim it'll stop school
What are they
shootings.
claiming that is the purpose of this?
And I mean, unless you're making the Ten Commandments out of Kevlar, I'm not really sure it's going to help with school shootings. But I mean, honestly, I said this to the lawmaker when I said, it's not, the idea that's going to stop school shootings is ridiculous. I mean, if you want to stop school shootings, it's called guns. That's the problem. But there's literally a Ten Commandment monument with actually this exact same language, by the way, the gerrymandered, inaccurate language, a little monument on the backside of the Capitol. And as I pointed out to the lawmakers, there's a Ten Commandment monument right here on this property that hasn't meant the people inside this building are acting according to it. So I don't know why we think it's going to change behavior inside of school either, just because you posted it somewhere. So as we close up, I want to just note a couple of things. If you want to follow more, the main place that I write about religion politics today is a newsletter called A Public Witness. You can find that at publicwitness.wordandway.org. I also have a QR code, so I'll put this over here on the table. I forgot to grab more of these, but if you want to take a quick QR code and sign up for that at publicwitness.wordandway.org. And I do have 2 books on Christian nationalism. The first one I co-wrote with Bo Underwood, and it's called Baptizing America, How Mainline Protestants Help Build Christian Nationalism. This one primarily looks at the emergence of Christian nationalism in the late 1940s, throughout the 1950s, and the early 60s, and how that impacts what we're having today. So this is when so we were not founded as a Christian nation, but the things that people point to as evidence of as a Christian nation all happened in this post-war period. In God We Trust is the national model, and Under God, in the Pledge of Allegiance, all this stuff gets added. The Christian National Prayer Breakfast and National Day of Prayer, all that stuff's happening in this era to make us more of a Christian nation, if you will. So we unpack how that happens, why it's problematic. And then a new one that just came out last month, The Bible According to Christian Nationalists, Exploring Scripture for Political Power. This one is all about how the Bible is being misused in politics today, with a lot of examples and then ways for us to read the Bible better. I promise this is the funniest book you will read on Christian nationalism.
It is. I can attest to it.
It's a low bar, don't get me wrong, but it's still the funniest. Most of them aren't funny at all. So anyway, I do have some copies. The newest one's thinner, so it's funnier and thinner, so it's 15, and Baptizing America is 20. And I can do Venmo or cash or check. But thanks everyone for coming. It's really meaningful to have people show up, because I think these are really important issues that we're dealing with today. So it means a lot that you came.